Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we'll wander into one of the most defining moments in America's past, the Civil War, a conflict that unfolded across forests and rivers, over mountains and plains, and through towns that still carry its quiet traces. It was a war of cannons and camps, but also of letters written by firelight, of songs drifting through the night air, and of hopes carried and shattered. Battlefields once filled with smoke are now silent meadows. Yet if you pause there long enough, you might almost sense the echoes, voices of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. The Civil War was not only a clash of armies, but a turning point for a nation's identity, reshaping freedom, power, and the meaning of unity. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like and subscribe, or simply share a thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is rest. Get comfortable and allow the weight of the day to drift away as we begin our journey into the quiet echoes of history. Let's begin. The Civil War saw the first battle between ironclad warships. When the Civil War began, ships were still built mostly from wood, their sails and planks not so different from those that had crossed the Atlantic centuries before. But in March of 1862, at Hampton Roads in Virginia, the world witnessed something entirely new: the clash of ironclad warships. The Confederate vessel CSS Virginia, once a scuttled Union frigate rebuilt and armored with iron, faced off against the Union's experimental USS Monitor. Cannon fire that would have shredded wooden ships bounced harmlessly off their iron plates. For hours they circled and pounded one another, unable to deliver a killing blow, until both sides withdrew. Though indecisive as a battle, it was decisive for history. Wooden fleets became instantly obsolete. Naval warfare had changed forever, not with a single invention, but with the thunderous ringing of iron against iron. The USS Monitor introduced the world's first rotating naval gun turret. Before the Monitor, warships bristled with cannons fixed along their sides. To aim, the entire ship had to turn, a slow and vulnerable process. The Monitor, designed by Swedish engineer John Ericsson, carried something revolutionary: a round, rotating iron turret. Inside it, two powerful cannons could be turned in any direction, independent of the ship's movement. This meant the Monitor could fight at close quarters, aiming with speed and precision never before possible. Sailors inside the turret endured deafening noise and smoke, but from outside it looked like a strange mechanical tower, turning smoothly atop the vessel's flat deck. Though small and ungainly compared to traditional ships, the Monitor's design became a blueprint for modern navies. Today, every warship that carries turreted guns owes something to that strange little vessel, born in urgency, tested in fire, and remembered as a turning point in maritime history. The Confederate submarine CSS Hunley became the first sub to sink a warship. By the mid-19th century, submarines were more science fiction than reality, experimental, dangerous contraptions tested in secret. Yet in Charleston Harbor, the Confederacy launched a desperate gamble: the hand-cranked submarine CSS Hunley. Barely 40 feet long, powered by a crew of men turning a crankshaft, it carried a spar torpedo fixed to its bow, essentially a bomb on a pole. On a February night in 1864, the Hunley crept toward the Union warship USS Housatonic. With a muffled explosion, the torpedo tore into the vessel, sending it to the bottom. The Hunley had made history, the first submarine to sink a ship in combat. Yet the victory came at a cost. The Hunley itself never returned. Found over a century later and raised in 1995, It remains both a marvel and a mystery, its crew still a silent reminder of daring and sacrifice. Union balloonists spied from the sky with a balloon corps. Long before airplanes, the Civil War introduced military aviation in the form of gas-filled balloons. Professor Thaddeus Lowe convinced the Union Army to establish a balloon corps. From baskets tethered high above the battlefield, balloonists observed enemy positions, artillery movements, and camp layouts. They communicated with the ground by waving flags or even telegraphing messages down wires that ran from the basket to earth. Rising above the chaos, these aerial observers offered commanders an entirely new perspective. But the balloons were vulnerable to weather, easily spotted by enemy fire, and difficult to move quickly. Though the corps was eventually disbanded, it left behind a startling image: fragile balloons swaying above forests and fields, while soldiers below fought in the mud and smoke. It was a glimpse of the sky as a new frontier of war, one that future generations would seize with wings of wood, canvas, and steel. Telegraph wires carried real-time battlefield updates to Lincoln. Before the Civil War, news of battles might take days to reach leaders. But during the conflict, the telegraph transformed communication. Lines stretched alongside railroads and across newly conquered ground, so commanders could send reports almost instantly. For Abraham Lincoln, this meant he could sit in the War Department's telegraph office and read updates in near real time, his hands sometimes trembling as he held the fresh slips of paper. Telegraph operators worked tirelessly, encoding and decoding messages, stringing wires across dangerous territory, and repairing lines under fire. For the first time in history, a president could direct a war from his desk, bridging vast distances with electricity. This innovation not only altered strategy, it also made Lincoln intimately aware of his soldiers' struggles. Those quiet rooms filled with clicking keys became the nerve centers of an entire nation, connected by thin strands of copper buzzing with urgency. Secret codes protected Union telegraphs from interception. With information now traveling rapidly over telegraph wires, secrecy became as important as speed. The Union developed elaborate ciphers to protect its communications. One of the most effective was a system of root ciphers, in which words or letters were rearranged in complex patterns that could only be unscrambled with the correct key. Anson Steger, a telegraph expert, designed codes that baffled Confederate interceptors, who often found themselves holding strings of nonsense. Operators became skilled not only in tapping messages, but in securing them, blending the art of cryptography with the urgency of war. This was one of the first large-scale uses of encryption in American history, a reminder that technology always brings both new strengths and new vulnerabilities. As invisible messages raced along humming wires, the hidden battle of codes and ciphers unfolded quietly, shaping decisions that determined the outcome of campaigns. Signal flags flashed messages in a binary-style code. When wires weren't available, armies still needed to send messages across hills and fields. Enter the signal flag, or wigwag system, invented by Albert J. Meyer. With just one flag, an operator could wave motions representing dots and dashes, a kind of visual Morse code. Observers with telescopes picked up the signals from far away, then relayed them onward, creating chains of communication stretching for miles. In some cases, both Union and Confederate forces could see the flags, yet only those trained in the code could understand their meaning. These signals allowed armies to coordinate attacks, warn of danger, and even direct artillery fire. At night, lanterns replaced flags, blinking in patterns across the darkness. Though simple, the system showed how ingenuity could transform something as ordinary as a flag into a tool of precise, lightning-fast communication. Repeating rifles let some troops fire 7 shots without reloading. Most soldiers in the Civil War carried muzzle-loading rifles that required biting open a cartridge, pouring powder, ramming the bullet, and capping the weapon. A slow and vulnerable process in battle. But a handful of Union units were issued repeating rifles, like the Spencer or Henry. These weapons stored multiple rounds in a magazine, allowing a soldier to fire 7 or more shots before stopping to reload. In the heat of combat, this firepower was astonishing. Confederates facing these weapons often believed they were outnumbered, so relentless was the storm of bullets. Lincoln himself tested a Spencer rifle on the White House lawn and was impressed. Though expensive and not widely distributed, repeating rifles hinted at the future of warfare. They made clear that the balance was shifting, from disciplined volleys of musket fire to the overwhelming power of rapid, repeating shots. The Gatling gun previewed the machine gun age. In the midst of the Civil War, inventor Richard Gatling patented a weapon that would foreshadow the wars of the future. The Gatling gun featured multiple barrels rotating around a central shaft, fired by a hand crank. While not fully automatic, it could unleash a torrent of bullets far faster than any soldier could load and shoot by hand. The Union purchased limited numbers, and though it never dominated Civil War battlefields, its mere presence was unsettling. Gatling himself believed his invention would reduce the size of armies by making war too deadly to fight, a paradoxical hope that history did not fulfill. Still, the Gatling gun represented a leap toward mechanized warfare. Watching its barrels spin and spit fire must have seemed like something out of another century, an eerie glimpse of the industrial horrors yet to come. Minié balls and rifled muskets made frontal charges devastating. For centuries, smoothbore muskets had limited range and accuracy, so armies fought in tight formations, firing volleys at close distance. But the Civil War brought the widespread use of rifled muskets firing conical Minié balls. The grooves inside the barrel spun the bullet, greatly increasing accuracy and distance. Suddenly, soldiers could be struck hundreds of yards away with lethal precision. Yet tactics lagged behind technology. Generals still ordered frontal assaults in dense lines, as if muskets had not evolved. The result was catastrophe. Entire regiments cut down in minutes, fields littered with the fallen before they even reached the enemy's lines. This grim mismatch between old strategy and new firepower explains why the war's battles were so staggeringly bloody. It marked the painful transition from the warfare of the past to the mechanized slaughter of the modern age. Battlefield triage was invented during the war. In earlier wars, the wounded were often left where they fell, and medical attention came only after the fighting stopped. The Civil War changed that. Military surgeon Jonathan Letterman devised a system of battlefield triage, sorting the wounded by urgency rather than by rank or chance. Those who needed immediate care were attended first, while others were stabilized and moved later. It seems obvious now, but at the time, it was revolutionary. Letterman's system meant that thousands of lives could be saved by organization alone. Evacuation routes, field hospitals, and designated treatment areas all became part of a structured medical network. The chaos of war, at least in part, gave birth to modern emergency medicine. Today, the principles of triage, born in bloody fields of the 1860s, are still used in hospitals, ambulances, and disaster zones all over the world. Ambulance Corps created modern emergency evacuation. Before the Civil War, the idea of dedicated ambulances barely existed. Injured soldiers often relied on comrades to carry them, or they were left behind altogether. Jonathan Letterman's reforms didn't stop at triage. He also organized the first true ambulance corps. Horse-drawn wagons, marked for medical service, raced onto battlefields to retrieve the wounded. Teams of stretcher-bearers were trained to move quickly but carefully, bringing men from the line of fire to safety. At Antietam and Gettysburg, This system proved its worth, saving countless lives that would otherwise have been lost to shock or bleeding. It was the birth of the concept that the injured deserved immediate, structured evacuation. Today's paramedics and emergency response units are direct descendants of those early ambulance teams, born out of necessity and remembered as one of the quiet revolutions hidden within the storm of the Civil War. Anesthesia was widely used in amputations. The image of screaming soldiers held down during brutal amputations is one of the darkest myths of the Civil War. In truth, anesthesia was widely available, and most surgeries were performed under ether or chloroform. These agents, administered by soaked cloths or special inhalers, allowed surgeons to operate with relative calm. Amputations were common not because doctors were careless, but because shattered bones from Minié balls often left no other choice. With infection looming, removal of a limb could save a life. Patients slipped into unconsciousness, unaware of the saws and scalpels. Though antisepsis and germ theory were still in their infancy, the widespread use of anesthesia meant that most operations were not performed cold. For a war remembered as brutal, this detail reveals a surprising truth. Even amid suffering, medicine was advancing, carrying with it a measure of mercy in the face of unimaginable pain. Disease killed more soldiers than combat. Cannons and bullets filled the headlines, but the deadliest enemy of the Civil War was invisible. Disease claimed more lives than all battles combined. Camps crowded with men became breeding grounds for dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, and malaria. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and limited knowledge of bacteria meant that infections spread unchecked. A soldier was statistically more likely to die from illness than from gunfire. Diaries from the time speak of endless fevers, endless weakness, and the sorrow of watching comrades fade away without ever stepping into combat. Surgeons did their best, but antibiotics were decades away. Sometimes the only remedy was rest and hope. These losses rarely appeared in grand stories of battle, yet they shaped the war as profoundly as Gettysburg or Antietam. Disease was the silent foe, claiming hundreds of thousands, and reminding us that the struggle for survival often extends beyond the battlefield itself. Embalming became common so families could reclaim bodies. Before the Civil War, embalming was rare in America. But with soldiers dying far from home, families longed to reclaim their loved ones for burial. Embalmers set up near battlefields, offering services that allowed bodies to be transported without rapid decay. They used chemical solutions injected into arteries, preserving features long enough for journeys by rail or wagon. The practice became so common that embalming wagons followed Union armies, displaying signs advertising their services. Officers whose families could afford the cost were among the most frequently embalmed. Though it may sound morbid, the practice allowed grieving families the chance to say farewell. After the war, the popularity of embalming spread to civilian life, reshaping American funeral traditions. What began as a wartime necessity became a cultural norm, ensuring that the innovations of battlefield morticians would endure far beyond the final volleys of cannon fire. Clara Barton was nicknamed the Angel of the Battlefield. Few figures shine as brightly in Civil War history as Clara Barton. A schoolteacher turned nurse, she appeared wherever the need was greatest, tending the wounded on bloody battlefields like Antietam and Fredericksburg. She delivered bandages, food, and water, often moving through gunfire to reach the fallen. Soldiers remembered her calm voice and gentle hands, and soon she was known as the Angel of the Battlefield. After the war, Barton's tireless service led her to found the American Red Cross, an institution that continues her mission of compassion. What makes her story remarkable is not just her courage, but her persistence. In a time when women were often discouraged from public roles, she carved her own path with determination. Barton's legacy is more than medicine. It is a reminder that even in the darkest hours of war, humanity can rise in quiet, steadfast service. Dorothea Dix set strict codes for Union nurses. When Dorothea Dix was appointed Superintendent of Army Nurses, she faced a daunting task, organizing women to serve in military hospitals at a time when the idea was still controversial. Determined to maintain professionalism, she imposed strict rules. Nurses had to be over 25, plain in appearance, and dressed in dark, modest clothing. She believed this would prevent distraction and ensure respect in a male-dominated environment. Her standards were so severe that some called her the Dragon Dix, but her discipline laid the groundwork for nursing as a respected profession. Under her leadership, thousands of women served with courage, transforming the image of nursing from a makeshift role into a vocation of skill and dignity. Though her methods were rigid, her impact was lasting. A generation of women proved their worth in hospitals, helping to shape the modern face of medical care. The U.S. Sanitary Commission saved lives with hygiene reforms. Disease, poor diet, and unsanitary conditions killed countless soldiers, but civilian volunteers rose to meet the challenge. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, founded in 1861, became a massive relief organization. Its inspectors visited camps, advising on hygiene, waste disposal, and ventilation. They pushed for clean water, better cooking, and the removal of filth that bred sickness. At the same time, they raised millions in donations and distributed tons of medical supplies. The Commission organized hospital ships, staffed relief stations, and educated soldiers on simple practices like hand washing and camp cleanliness. These efforts saved thousands of lives, even though the germ theory of disease was not yet fully understood. By combining compassion with practicality, the Sanitary Commission showed that civilian energy could have national impact. It was one of the earliest examples of organized public health and a turning point in America's understanding of prevention. Sanitary fairs raised millions with public charity. To fund their work, the U.S. Sanitary Commission relied on an extraordinary invention of community spirit, the Sanitary Fair. Held in cities across the North, these vast events combined exhibition, entertainment, and fundraising. Visitors could stroll through displays of art, new inventions, or even battle relics. Auctions sold donated goods, from quotes to rare books. Bands played, speakers lectured, and crowds marveled at the creativity on display. Proceeds went directly to medical supplies and relief. In an age before mass philanthropy, these fairs were remarkable demonstrations of civic engagement. Women were often at the forefront, organizing, planning, and managing the complex events. Together, these fairs raised millions of dollars for the care of soldiers. Beyond the money, they gave communities a sense of participation, a way to feel that they, too, were contributing to the fight, not with rifles or cannons, but with imagination and generosity. Greenbacks introduced a permanent national paper currency. Financing a vast war required new solutions. In 1862, the Union introduced greenbacks, paper money not backed by gold or silver, but by government promise. At first, many distrusted the bills, unsure if they would hold value. Yet as the war pressed on, greenbacks became widely accepted, fueling the economy and allowing the government to pay soldiers and suppliers. The name came from the green ink on the reverse side, a color that soon became synonymous with American money. Though inflation and controversy followed, the greenbacks marked a bold step toward a national currency, replacing the patchwork of state banknotes. The Civil War forced the government to innovate financially, just as it did militarily. By the war's end, paper money was here to stay, its future as enduring as the Union itself. Every dollar bill in circulation today carries a trace of that wartime experiment. national banking acts unified America's money system. Before the Civil War, America's financial system was fragmented. State-chartered banks issued their own notes, and the value varied wildly. To create stability and fund the Union, Congress passed the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864. These laws encouraged banks to join a national system, issue standardized currency, and hold federal bonds. The familiar look and feel of US banknotes began here, with uniform designs that inspired confidence. The system also gave the federal government stronger control over finance, a shift with long-term consequences for American economic power. What began as a wartime necessity became the foundation of modern banking in the United States. The paper and wallet today, uniform and backed by law, owes its existence to decisions made amid the uncertainty of battlefields, when financial unity was as vital to victory as unity of arms. The first federal income tax was levied during the war. Wars are expensive, and the Civil War demanded resources on a scale America had never seen. To fund the fight, the Union introduced the nation's first federal income tax in 1861. Citizens earning above a certain threshold were required to pay a small percentage to the government. At first, it was modest, but as the war continued, rates increased. Alongside new taxes on goods and services, the income tax filled government coffers with desperately needed revenue. Though it expired after the war, the precedent had been set. Later generations would reinstate it permanently. The Civil War's tax laws remind us that financial innovation often follows crisis. By reaching directly into citizens' incomes, the government created a model of shared sacrifice. Controversial, yes, but effective. The foundations of America's modern tax system were laid not in peacetime, but in the urgency of civil war. The Homestead Act opened millions of acres to settlers. While the Civil War raged, the federal government also looked westward. In 1862, the Homestead Act was signed into law, offering settlers 160 acres of public land if they would live on it and cultivate it for 5 years. Thousands seized the opportunity, staking claims on the Great Plains, prairies, and forests. It was one of the largest land redistribution programs in history, and it helped populate vast stretches of the West. Many homesteaders faced brutal weather, isolation, and hardship, yet the promise of ownership drew them on. The act reshaped the American landscape, even as armies clashed far to the east. It is a reminder that history unfolds in layers. While battlefields roared with cannon fire, quiet wagons rolled west, carrying families into new frontiers. The nation was both breaking apart and expanding at once, forging a paradoxical legacy of conflict and growth. The Pacific Railway Act launched the Transcontinental Railroad. The dream of a railroad stretching from ocean to ocean had long seemed impossible. But in 1862, as the Union fought to preserve itself, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act. It authorized the construction of the first transcontinental railroad, uniting east and west with steel tracks. Construction crews, often made up of immigrants and freedmen, began the grueling work of cutting through mountains, bridging rivers, and crossing plains. The war itself made the project more urgent. A unified, accessible continent would strengthen the Union's power and economy. Though the Golden Spike would not be driven until 1869, the groundwork was laid during the Civil War. In the midst of destruction, the nation also built pathways of connection. The iron rails became arteries of commerce and migration, proving that even in the shadow of conflict, vision and ambition could carve out a lasting future. The Morrill Act created America's first land-grant colleges. Education might seem far removed from battlefields, yet in 1862, President Lincoln signed the Morrill Land-Grant College Act. This law gave states federal land to sell, using the profits to fund colleges specializing in agriculture, engineering, and science. The idea was simple: strengthen the nation by educating its people in practical fields. Out of this act grew many of today's great public universities. Students learned skills that fueled industry, farming, and innovation. The war had forced the government to think not only about survival, but about the future. Investing in education during conflict was a bold choice, and one that paid dividends for generations. The Morrill Act stands as a reminder that even amid violence and division, leaders were planting seeds of progress. Universities across the country still trace their roots back to that single act of wartime vision. West Virginia became a new Union state in 1863. The Civil War didn't just divide North and South, it divided states themselves. In Virginia, loyalty was fractured. The mountainous western counties, less dependent on slavery, resisted secession and favored the Union. In 1863, these counties were admitted as a brand new state, West Virginia. It was the only state created by splitting from a Confederate state during the war. The process was controversial, raising questions about legality, yet it gave the Union a strategic stronghold in Appalachia. For residents, it meant forging a new identity, while conflict raged nearby. Today, West Virginia's very existence is a living legacy of the Civil War, a reminder that borders and allegiances are not fixed, but shaped by the pressures of history. The state's motto, "Mountaineers are always free," reflects both the rugged independence of its people and the extraordinary circumstances of its birth. Nevada achieved statehood during the war for Union votes. Far to the west, in the deserts and mining camps of Nevada, another state was born. In 1864, Nevada was rushed into the Union, even though its population was small. The reasons were political as much as practical. Nevada's vast silver deposits promised wealth for the Union, but more importantly, statehood meant more electoral votes in the looming presidential election. Abraham Lincoln needed support to secure re-election, and Nevada delivered. It became known as the battle-born state, its very motto a nod to its wartime origins. Though far from the battlefields, Nevada's entry shaped the balance of power in Washington. It illustrates how the Civil War was not only fought with muskets and cannons, but with ballots, statehood, and political maneuvering. Even distant territories played a role in the struggle to preserve and redefine the Union. The U.S. Navy remained racially integrated. While the Union Army initially resisted integrating black soldiers, the U.S. Navy did not. Throughout the Civil War, black and white sailors served side by side on ships. They shared duties in cramped quarters, manned guns together, and endured the same hardships at sea. Though discrimination persisted in ranks and pay, the integrated Navy stood in contrast to the segregated Army. For many African Americans, naval service offered a rare opportunity for steady wages and some measure of equality. Their contributions were critical to blockades, river patrols, and battles at sea. This integration foreshadowed later reforms in the armed forces, though it would take nearly a century for full equality to be recognized. The Civil War Navy quietly carried a lesson that shared service and sacrifice could transcend racial lines, even if society on land was not yet ready to follow. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers joined the Union Army. After the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, black enlistment surged. Nearly 200,000 African American men joined the Union Army, many in units known as the United States Colored Troops USCT. To them, the war was not abstract. It was a fight for freedom, dignity, and a new place in society. They faced lower pay at first, harsher conditions, and a constant risk that capture could mean enslavement or death. Yet their courage was undeniable. At battles like Milliken's Bend and Port Hudson, they proved their valor under fire. Their service changed minds in the North, showing that formerly enslaved men could fight as bravely as any. Frederick Douglass captured the moment best. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter, Use S. Let him get an eagle on his button, and there is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to re. Citizenship. The 54th Massachusetts proved black valor at Fort Wagner. Among the most famous African-American regiments was the 54th Massachusetts, formed under the leadership of Colonel Robert Goode Shaw. In July 1863, they led a daring assault on Fort Wagner, a heavily defended Confederate stronghold near Charleston. The attack was brutal, with heavy casualties, and Shaw himself was killed. Yet the bravery of the 54th was undeniable. Witnesses reported their discipline under fire and their refusal to retreat even as losses mounted. Though the assault failed, the regiment's courage electrified Northern opinion and helped inspire further recruitment of black soldiers. Their story became a symbol of sacrifice and equality, a living proof that African-American soldiers would fight and die for the Union cause. Monuments stand today in their honor, a reminder that their blood helped redefine what freedom meant, and who in America had earned the right to claim it. Confederates refused to exchange captured black troops as equals. When the Union began recruiting black soldiers, the Confederacy reacted with hostility. Confederate leaders declared that captured African-American troops would not be treated as prisoners of war. Instead, many faced execution or re-enslavement. This refusal shattered the existing prisoner exchange system, which had allowed captured men on both sides to be swapped and sent home. Without exchanges, thousands of soldiers, black and white alike, endured the horrors of overcrowded prisons such as Andersonville and Elmira. The Confederacy's policy was both cruel and strategic, meant to discourage enlistment and assert racial dominance. But the opposite occurred. Northern outrage grew stronger, and support for emancipation deepened. The courage of black soldiers, who fought on despite these risks, remains one of the most striking aspects of the Civil War. Their determination, even in the face of such brutal policies, helped redefine the very meaning of freedom and equality. Escaped enslaved people were labeled contraband and sheltered by Union forces. Early in the war, Union generals faced a dilemma: what to do with enslaved people who fled to Union lines. Returning them seemed unthinkable, yet the law was unclear. In 1861, General Benjamin Butler declared that such individuals would be considered contraband of war, property seized from the enemy. The word was cold, but the effect was profound. Thousands of men, women, and children sought refuge in Union camps, where they built new lives in makeshift contraband camps. Many worked for the army, while others later enlisted as soldiers. These camps were often crowded and harsh, yet they represented a first step toward freedom. By labeling humans as contraband, the Union created a legal loophole that gradually eroded slavery's grip. The policy showed how war reshapes language and law, turning the tide not just with battles, but with decisions that opened pathways to liberty. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the war's purpose to freedom. When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, the Civil War was transformed. At its start, the Union fought primarily to preserve itself. But with one document, the struggle also became a fight to end slavery. The proclamation declared that enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free, though its immediate reach was limited. Symbolically, however, it was a thunderclap. It gave moral clarity to the Union cause, discouraged foreign powers like Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy, and paved the way for the enlistment of black soldiers. For enslaved people across the South, it became a beacon of hope, a promise that the tide of history was turning. Though freedom was not yet universal, The proclamation marked a point of no return. From that moment forward, the Civil War was not just about union, it was about liberty. Juneteenth marked Emancipation's arrival in Texas. While the Emancipation Proclamation declared freedom in Confederate states in 1863, its enforcement depended on Union military presence. In remote Texas, slavery endured until June 19, 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston. He read General Order No. 3, announcing that all slaves are free. For thousands, it was the first time freedom had been proclaimed directly to them. Celebrations erupted, with songs, prayers, and gatherings marking the moment. This day became known as Juneteenth, blending Juna and 19th. Though born in Texas, it spread as freedmen and their descendants carried the tradition across the country. Today, it is recognized as a national holiday, commemorating not only emancipation, but the endurance of hope through delay. Juneteenth reminds us that freedom's arrival was not a single moment, but a patchwork of struggles and victories, unfolding unevenly across the vast landscape of America. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery nationwide. Though the Emancipation Proclamation was powerful, it was limited. True abolition required a constitutional amendment. In 1864, after fierce debate, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, declaring that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. This was not just policy, it was permanence. Lincoln pushed tirelessly for its passage, knowing that without it, slavery might return in some form after the war. The amendment passed the Senate in 1864, then the House in January 1864, amid emotional scenes of applause and tears. Ratification by the states followed later that year, after Lincoln's death. The amendment marked the legal death of slavery in America, though its shadow would linger in discrimination and inequality. It was one of the war's most profound legacies, proof that even through the fire of conflict, the nation could emerge changed, carrying forward the promise of freedom for generations. The Lieber Code pioneered the modern laws of war. In 1863, the Union Army adopted a groundbreaking set of rules known as the Lieber Code, named after legal scholar Francis Lieber. These instructions for the government of armies of the United States in the field set standards for conduct in warfare. They addressed the treatment of prisoners, civilians, and property, forbidding unnecessary cruelty while recognizing the harsh realities of conflict. The Lieber Code was the first comprehensive attempt to codify the ethics of war in a modern sense. It influenced later international agreements, including the Geneva Conventions. Though violations occurred, the code represented a shift. Even in war, there must be rules. That such an idea emerged amid the brutality of the Civil War is striking. It suggests that the search for humanity persists even when nations are locked in deadly struggle, a reminder that law and conscience are never fully absent, even in chaos. The Confederacy introduced conscription before the Union. By 1862, the Confederacy was running short of volunteers. To sustain its armies, it introduced conscription, the first mass draft in American history. All white men of certain ages were required to serve, unless exempted by law. The policy was controversial, sparking resentment among those who saw it as an infringement on liberty. Wealthy planters were often excused if they owned a certain number of enslaved people, leading to accusations that it was a rich man's war, poor man's fight. The Union would later follow with its own draft, but the Confederacy had already set the precedent. Conscription highlighted the desperate manpower needs of both sides, and the social tensions it created lingered throughout the war. The idea that government could compel military service was new for Americans, and its debut amid Civil War ensured that it would never be forgotten. Draft riots in New York became America's deadliest civil unrest. In July of 1863, New York City erupted in violence. When the Union draft began, resentment boiled over, fueled by anger that wealthy men could buy their way out of service and by racist fears of competition from freed black workers. Crowds stormed the streets, attacking draft offices, burning buildings, and targeting black residents with horrific brutality. For 4 days, chaos reigned. The police were overwhelmed, and federal troops, some rushed in directly from Gettysburg, had to restore order. By the time it ended, more than 100 people were dead, making it the deadliest civil disturbance in U.S. history. The draft riots revealed deep fractures within the North itself, showing that the Union struggle was not only against the Confederacy, but also within its own divided cities. The memory of those riots remains a sobering reminder of how war can tear at the fabric of society. Wealthy draftees could hire substitutes or pay commutation fees. The Union's draft law contained provisions that quickly became infamous. Draftees could avoid service by paying $300 or by hiring a substitute to serve in their place. For the working class, this sum was impossible, but for the wealthy, it offered an escape. The policy fueled the perception that the war was being fought by the poor, while the rich remained safe at home. A rich man's war, a poor man's fight, became a bitter refrain. The commutation system was intended to raise money while filling ranks, but instead it deepened social divisions. Some substitutes enlisted multiple times under different names to collect fees, deserting after each bounty. The controversy underscored how war exposed inequalities in society. Even as the Union fought to end slavery, questions of fairness and sacrifice swirled around its own methods of raising an army. Irish immigrants filled the famous Irish Brigade. Among the most storied Union units was the Irish Brigade, made up largely of Irish immigrants who had fled famine and hardship. They carried green flags alongside the stars and stripes and were known for their ferocity in battle. At Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg, they charged bravely, often against impossible odds, suffering devastating losses. Priests marched with them, offering blessings before assaults, and their courage earned respect from allies and enemies alike. Yet life was not easy for these soldiers. Many had left poverty in Ireland, only to face prejudice in America, and service in the brigade was both a way to prove loyalty and to carve out dignity. Their sacrifices became legendary, and monuments stand today in their honor. The Irish Brigade represents not just military valor, but the story of immigrants who, in fighting for their adopted country, helped to reshape its very identity. German 48ers brought European revolutionary experience. When revolutions failed across Europe in 1848, many political exiles fled to America. Known as the 48ers, these immigrants brought with them radical ideas and military experience. During the Civil War, thousands joined the Union Army, forming German regiments and contributing leadership. Some, like Franz Sigel, became generals, while others served as seasoned officers who understood modern tactics. They brought a cosmopolitan flair to the Union cause, carrying the spirit of European revolution into America's fight. Their presence was not without controversy. Native-born soldiers sometimes distrusted them, and language barriers created challenges. But the 48ers' commitment was real. They had fought for liberty once, and now fought again on new soil. Their story is a reminder that the Civil War was not only an American conflict, but also part of a broader global struggle for freedom and democratic ideals. The Civil War reached New Mexico at Glorieta Pass. The Civil War was not confined to the East. In 1862, Confederate forces pushed into the New Mexico Territory, hoping to claim the Southwest and its resources. They were met by Union troops and local volunteers at Glorieta Pass, a narrow corridor through the Rocky Mountains. The battle that followed was small compared to Eastern clashes, but its outcome was significant. Union forces destroyed the Confederate supply train, forcing them to retreat and ending their hopes of controlling the region. Glorieta Pass is sometimes called the Gettysburg of the West, a reminder that the Civil War touched landscapes far from Virginia and Tennessee. Adobe villages, desert mesas, and mountain passes all became part of the conflict's geography. The battle highlights how the war was not just about North and South, but about the future of the entire continent, stretching from the Atlantic to the far Southwest. Cherokee leader Stand Watie became the last Confederate general to surrender. In Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, Native American nations were drawn into the conflict, divided in their loyalties. Among the most prominent figures was Stand Watie, a Cherokee leader who sided with the Confederacy. He became a brigadier general, leading cavalry raids and commanding native troops. Even as the Confederacy crumbled in 1864, Watie continued to fight, holding out long after most Confederate generals had surrendered. It was not until June of that year that he finally laid down arms, making him the last Confederate general to do so. His story reveals the complex ways native nations were entangled in the Civil War, caught between promises, alliances, and survival. Stand Watie remains a controversial figure, but his endurance and final surrender symbolize both the breadth of the war and its lingering hold, stretching deep into lands often left out of the familiar Civil War. Story: guerrilla warfare turned the Missouri-Kansas border into chaos. While massive armies clashed in the east, the border between Missouri and Kansas descended into a brutal guerrilla war. Armed bands, sometimes called bushwhackers or jayhawkers, raided towns, burned homes, and massacred civilians. The conflict had roots in years of violence over slavery in the territory, and the Civil War only intensified it. Men like William Quantrill led infamous raids, the most notorious being the Lawrence Massacre, where more than 150 civilians were killed. Retaliation followed in a cycle of bloodshed that blurred the line between soldier and outlaw. For residents, daily life was marked by fear and uncertainty as the war's violence seeped into every corner of community life. The Missouri-Kansas border war shows that the Civil War was not only fought in grand battles, but also in savage, personal conflicts that left scars on the land and on memory long after the guns fell silent. Mosby's Rangers struck Union lines with lightning raids. In Virginia, Confederate cavalry officer John S. Mosby earned fame as the Gray Ghost. Leading a small band of Rangers, he specialized in sudden raids behind Union lines. His men would appear seemingly out of nowhere, strike supply depots or wagon trains, and vanish into the countryside before Union forces could react. They blended into local farms, aided by sympathetic civilians, and their mobility frustrated much larger Union armies. Mosby's daring operations tied down thousands of Union troops who might have been needed elsewhere. Though irregular, his tactics foreshadowed modern guerrilla warfare, proving that speed and surprise could offset numbers. After the war, Mosby's legend grew, his name becoming synonymous with elusive cunning. His story reminds us that the Civil War was not only fought in set-piece battles, but also in shadows and ambushes where small bands of riders could strike fear into entire armies. Stonewall Jackson died after being shot by his own men. At the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was at the height of his fame. His brilliant flank attack had stunned Union forces, and victory seemed within reach. But as night fell, tragedy struck. Returning from a reconnaissance, Jackson and his staff were mistaken for Union cavalry by their own pickets. A volley of musket fire ripped through the darkness, striking Jackson in the arm and hand. Surgeons amputated his arm, and he seemed to recover, but pneumonia soon set in. Days later, he died. His final words, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees," became legendary. Jackson's death was a crushing blow to the Confederacy, depriving Robert E. Lee of his most trusted lieutenant. It also stands as a haunting example of how fate and misidentification could change the course of history. Jackson's amputated arm was buried separately with a marker. When Stonewall Jackson was wounded at Chancellorsville, surgeons amputated his left arm to save his life. The limb was buried in a family cemetery at Elwood Manor, while Jackson himself was moved to recover. After his death, his body was laid to rest elsewhere, but his arm remained in its quiet grave, marked by a simple stone. Visitors over the years have come to see this unusual resting place, where part of the general lies apart from the whole. The site has become a curious symbol, at once solemn and slightly macabre, of how the Civil War scattered lives and legacies. Jackson's arm is perhaps the most famous body part in American history to have its own memorial. It speaks to the reverence and myth-making that surrounded Confederate heroes, and to the strange, sometimes surreal details that emerge from the tapestry of war. The siege of Vicksburg gave the Union the Mississippi River. Perched on high bluffs overlooking a bend in the Mississippi River, Vicksburg was the Confederacy's fortress in the West. Union General Ulysses S. Grant made its capture his mission in 1863. After failed assaults and daring maneuvers, he settled into a siege. For 47 days, Union guns pounded the city, while civilians dug caves into hillsides to escape the bombardment. Food ran out, and desperate residents ate mules, dogs, and rats. On July the 4th, Confederate General John C. Pemberton surrendered. The fall of Vicksburg gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi, splitting the Confederacy in two and fulfilling a key part of the Anaconda Plan. The victory, paired with Gettysburg just a day earlier, marked a turning point in the war. Vicksburg's surrender was not only a military triumph, but also a symbol of the Union's tightening grip, slowly squeezing the Confederacy into defeat. Grant attempted to bypass Vicksburg with canals and bayous. Before his final success at Vicksburg, General Grant tried a series of extraordinary engineering projects to outflank the city. His men dug canals, hoping to divert the Mississippi River and create new channels that would bypass Confederate guns. Others tried to navigate swamps and bayous with ironclads, cutting through dense forests and dragging supplies across mud. These efforts often failed, with rivers flooding camps or ships stuck in narrow passages. Soldiers joked about Grant's ditches, but the attempts showed determination and creativity. Even in failure, they wore down the defenders, spreading Union forces around the region and keeping pressure on the city. The canal attempts are a reminder that war is not only about battles, but also about experiments, persistence, and the willingness to try unconventional paths. Though the canals never worked as intended, they stand as symbols of innovation born from desperation. The Battle of the Crater created a massive pit of death. In July 1864, outside Petersburg, Union engineers dug a tunnel beneath Confederate lines and packed it with gunpowder. The plan was simple: blow a hole in the defenses and charge through. At dawn, the mine exploded, sending men, earth, and timbers skyward, leaving a crater 170 feet long and 30 feet deep. But poor leadership turned victory into disaster. Union troops poured into the crater instead of around it, becoming trapped as Confederates regrouped and fired down on them mercilessly. Thousands were killed or wounded in the chaos. The Battle of the Crater became a symbol of both ingenuity and tragedy, a reminder that bold ideas require careful execution. Today, the crater still exists as a scar on the landscape, silent testimony to the desperation, creativity, and human cost that defined the long struggle at Petersburg. Petersburg trench warfare foreshadowed World War I. By 1864, the Union and Confederate armies faced each other outside Petersburg, Virginia. Instead of a single climactic battle, both sides dug in. For 9 long months, soldiers lived in trenches stretching for miles. Earthworks, dugouts, and parapets turned the landscape into a grim maze. Constant skirmishes, sniper fire, and artillery bombardments wore men down in an exhausting stalemate. It was a preview of what the world would see half a century later on the fields of France in World War I. Life in the trenches was harsh: mud, rats, disease, and the ever-present threat of sudden death from above. Yet amidst the misery, soldiers carved makeshift shelters, shared food, and adapted to their strange underground existence. Petersburg showed that technology had outpaced tactics, making frontal assaults nearly suicidal. The war's closing months thus offered a glimpse of the industrial warfare to come, a future of trenches, attrition, and endurance. Sherman's march to the sea aimed to break Southern morale. In late 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman embarked on one of the most controversial campaigns of the war, his march from Atlanta to Savannah. Instead of focusing solely on Confederate armies, Sherman aimed to cripple the South's capacity and will to fight by targeting infrastructure, supplies, and morale. His troops tore up railroads, destroyed factories, and confiscated food, leaving behind a swath of destruction. Yet Sherman avoided indiscriminate violence. Civilian homes were often spared if no resistance was offered. The campaign was psychological as much as physical. By cutting a wide path through Georgia, he demonstrated the Confederacy's vulnerability. Savannah fell without a major battle, and Sherman presented it to Lincoln as a Christmas gift. The march remains debated, seen by some as ruthless and by others as necessary. Either way, it marked a turning point, a war not just against armies, but against the systems that sustained them. Sherman's neckties were rails twisted around trees. Among Sherman's most memorable tactics was the destruction of Confederate railroads. His troops heated iron rails over bonfires until they glowed red, then twisted them around trees or into loops. These mangled remains, dubbed Sherman's neckties, were useless without complete reforging. Railroads were the arteries of the Confederacy, carrying troops, weapons, and food. By destroying them so thoroughly, Sherman ensured that repair was nearly impossible in wartime conditions. Soldiers often joked grimly as they wrapped the glowing metal, but the strategy had a serious purpose: to choke supply lines and prevent Confederate armies from regrouping. The sight of warped iron snaking through forests and towns left a psychological mark as well, a reminder that Union forces could reach deep into the South's heartland. Today, the twisted rails remain a potent symbol of total war, not just defeating armies, but dismantling the infrastructure of resistance. Sheridan's cavalry burned the Shenandoah Valley's crops and barns. Known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy, the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia supplied Southern armies with vital food. In 1864, Union General Philip Sheridan led a campaign to deny the Confederacy this resource. His troops swept through the valley, burning barns, crops, mills, and livestock, anything that could sustain the enemy. Civilians were left devastated, their livelihoods destroyed in what became known as the Burning. It was a harsh strategy, designed to starve the Confederate war effort into collapse. Though difficult to reconcile with traditional notions of honorable warfare, the campaign was effective. Confederate armies found themselves increasingly hungry and undersupplied. The valley, once a fertile and contested prize, became a barren wasteland. Sheridan's actions revealed the brutal logic of total war. If you could not defeat the enemy in battle alone, you could break their ability and their will to fight by striking at their sustenance. Food shortages led to bread riots in Richmond. By 1863, life in the Confederate capital of Richmond had grown desperate. Inflation soared, supplies dwindled, and food prices climbed beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. On April 2nd, a crowd of mostly women gathered, demanding bread to feed their families. Their anger boiled over into what became the Richmond Bread Riot. Marchers stormed shops and warehouses, seizing food and goods. Jefferson Davis himself confronted the crowd, tossing coins and ordering them to disperse. But the unrest revealed how fragile the Confederacy's home front had become. Similar food riots erupted across the South, driven by scarcity and inequality. For all the images of cavalry charges and battlefield heroics, the Civil War was also fought in kitchens and markets, where hunger gnawed at morale. The bread riots showed that war's toll extended far beyond the armies, striking at the very heart of daily survival for civilians left behind. Salt became a precious wartime commodity. In the 19th century, salt was not just a seasoning, it was essential. Without refrigeration, salt preserved meat for armies and civilians alike. During the Civil War, both sides recognized its strategic importance. Salt works became military targets as armies fought to control supplies. The South, cut off by blockades, faced severe shortages. At Saltville, Virginia, Confederate defenders fought fiercely to hold vast salt works against Union attacks. Families rationed what little they had, and meat spoiled when salt ran out. Soldiers wrote longingly of bacon and ham that could no longer be kept fresh. Something as simple as a grain of salt became as valuable as gold, a reminder of how war magnifies the importance of everyday materials. The struggle over salt was not glamorous, but it was vital. Without it, food rotted, armies weakened, and the fragile balance of survival tipped ever closer to hunger. Confederate coffee substitutes included chicory and roasted okra seeds. For many soldiers and civilians, coffee was more than a drink. It was a comfort. But the Union blockade cut off southern ports, making imported coffee scarce. Desperate for substitutes, Southerners turned to creativity. They roasted chicory root, sweet potatoes, acorns, and even okra seeds, grinding them into brews that looked like coffee but rarely tasted like it. Diaries from the time described the results with mixed amusement and despair. Some concoctions were bitter, others weak, but all were better than nothing. Union soldiers, by contrast, often had abundant coffee, and the aroma of their brews drifting across camps became a source of envy. The story of Confederate coffee substitutes is a small but telling glimpse into wartime improvisation. Even in the face of scarcity, people clung to rituals of comfort, transforming humble roots and seeds into symbols of endurance and stubborn normalcy. Bat caves were mined for saltpeter to make gunpowder. Gunpowder requires 3 key ingredients: charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter. The Confederacy, cut off from international trade, turned to natural sources to meet its needs. Across the South, men and boys ventured into caves to scrape saltpeter-rich earth from the walls, a substance formed by the leavings of bats. The soil was leached, filtered, and refined into potassium nitrate, the critical component for powder. This work was dirty, exhausting, and often dangerous, with miners crawling through dark caverns by lantern light. Yet it sustained the Confederacy's war effort. Without these hidden resources, armies would have run out of ammunition far sooner. The sight of men hauling buckets of cave earth to be boiled down into powder speaks to the strange ways war reshapes labor. Even bats unknowingly became part of the conflict, their ancient caverns transformed into unlikely factories of war. Union brown water ironclads dominated rivers, while blue water navies patrolled the oceans. a very different fleet operated inland. The Union built a brown water navy of ironclads and gunboats designed for rivers. These squat, armored vessels bristled with cannons and steamed up the Mississippi, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers, smashing Confederate fortifications and supporting land campaigns. Designed by innovators like James Eads, many were built in astonishingly short times, with shipyards working around the clock. Their dominance on waterways was decisive, allowing Union forces to move supplies, cut off Southern trade, and penetrate deep into Confederate territory. Battles along rivers may lack the fame of Gettysburg or Antietam, but they were crucial. Control of rivers meant control of movement, and in a war where logistics mattered as much as bravery, the Brown Water Navy tipped the balance. These stubby ironclads, smoke belching as they churned upstream, were as revolutionary as any charge of infantry. Engineers built Bailey's Dam to save stranded Union gunboats. In 1864, during the Red River Campaign in Louisiana, a Union fleet found itself trapped. Falling water levels left ironclads stranded above rapids, unable to move downstream. Without rescue, the ships would be lost. Enter Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bailey, an engineer with a bold idea: build a massive dam to raise the river. Soldiers and laborers felled trees, hauled rocks, and constructed wing dams to funnel water into a rising pool. As the level climbed, the trapped vessels floated free, one by one, shooting the rapids to safety. Bailey's Dam was an extraordinary feat of improvisation, a blend of desperation and ingenuity. It saved the fleet and preserved Union control of the river. The story remains a testament to the power of engineering in war. Sometimes, survival hinged not on bravery with a rifle, but on the patient labor of men building with timber and stone. Confederate raider CSS Alabama terrorized Union shipping worldwide. Launched from a British shipyard in 1862, the CSS Alabama became the Confederacy's most famous commerce raider. For 2 years, under the command of Raphael Semmes, it prowled the oceans, capturing or sinking dozens of Union merchant vessels. Sleek and fast, it struck fear into shipping lanes from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The Alabama rarely fired unnecessary shots. Captured crews were usually released after their ships were burned or scuttled. Its exploits embarrassed the Union and infuriated American merchants. Finally, in 1864, off the coast of France, the USS Kearsarge engaged the Alabama in a dramatic duel. After a fierce exchange, the Alabama sank, ending its reign. Yet its legacy endured. The Alabama claims against Britain for allowing its construction led to an international arbitration case that reshaped diplomacy. The ship remains a legend of naval daring, a reminder of how the Civil War stretched across the globe. CSS Shenandoah fired some of the war's last shots in the Pacific. Far from the fields of Virginia, the Confederate raider CSS Shenandoah carried the war into distant oceans. Tasked with disrupting Union whaling fleets, it circled the globe, striking in waters as remote as the Arctic. In June 1864, weeks after Appomattox, the Shenandoah captured Union whalers in the Bering Sea, unaware that the Confederacy had already collapsed. Its crew only learned of the surrender months later, when they stopped in port. Fearing trial as pirates, they sailed the vessel all the way to Liverpool, surrendering to the British in November 1864. This made the Shenandoah the last Confederate ship to lower its flag. Its story shows how communication lag made the Civil War linger long after it had ended. The thunder of guns in the icy Pacific was among the war's final echoes, fired half a world away from the surrender at Appomattox. Blockade runners carried luxury goods through the Union blockade. The Union blockade sought to strangle the Confederacy, cutting off supplies from abroad. Yet daring captains defied it with sleek, low-slung steamers known as blockade runners. Painted grey to blend with the sea and built for speed, they slipped through Union patrols at night, often without lights. Their cargoes included weapons, medicine, and vital supplies, but also luxury items like silk, tea, and fine wine for wealthy buyers. The profits were immense, but so were the risks. Capture meant the loss of ship, cargo, and sometimes crew. The sight of a runner darting through the surf became legendary, a symbol of both ingenuity and desperation. Though they could not overcome the blockade's overall chokehold, blockade runners prolonged the Confederacy's resistance. They highlight the strange duality of war. Even as hunger gripped the South, some households dined on imported delicacies, carried in by shadowy ships skimming the waves. Matthew Brady's photos shocked the public with battlefield dead. Before the Civil War, most Americans had never seen photographs of war's aftermath. That changed with the work of Matthew Brady and his team of photographers, including Alexander Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan. They carried heavy equipment onto battlefields like Antietam, capturing haunting images of bodies sprawled in fields and trenches. When these photographs were displayed in New York, crowds were stunned. The images stripped away romantic notions of glory and revealed the raw cost of conflict. Newspapers wrote that Brady had brought home the terrible reality. Though the process was slow, no action shots could be taken. The stark stillness of the scene spoke louder than words. These photographs mark a turning point in public perception, the first time a nation truly saw its own dead preserved in detail. War was no longer just described, it was shown, and it could never again be unseen. The bugle call taps was created in 1862. One of the war's most enduring legacies is a simple, haunting melody. In July 1862, Union General Daniel Butterfield sought a new signal for lights out. With the help of a bugler, he arranged a series of gentle notes. The tune, soon called taps, replaced harsher calls and quickly spread through the army. Its soft rise and fall carried across camps, a signal of rest. Before long, it was used at funerals as well, its solemn beauty offering comfort amid grief. Taps became so closely tied to mourning that it remains the standard call at military funerals today, echoing across cemeteries with the same quiet power it held in Civil War camps. Its origins were simple, almost accidental, yet its legacy is profound. From the noise of battle came a melody of peace, destined to endure wherever soldiers are laid to rest. The Medal of Honor was born in the Civil War. In 1861, Congress authorized the creation of a medal to recognize extraordinary bravery. It became the Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor in the United States. Early recipients included sailors who risked their lives in naval battles and soldiers who captured enemy flags under fire. During the Civil War, more than 1,500 medals were awarded, often for acts that today would seem impossibly daring. Soldiers stormed fortifications, saved comrades, or stood firm when all seemed lost. The medal gave the Union a way to celebrate heroism in a war filled with sacrifice. Over time, the criteria grew stricter, but its essence remained the same: recognition of courage beyond duty. That this symbol of honor was born amid America's bloodiest conflict is fitting. It stands as both a tribute to individual valor and a reminder that even in the darkest times, acts of light shine through. Capturing enemy flags was considered the highest act of bravery. Civil War battles were guided by flags, tall banners that marked a regiment's position and rallied troops. To carry the flag was an honor but also a peril. Color bearers were prime targets for enemy fire. To seize an opponent's flag was considered one of the bravest feats a soldier could achieve. It symbolized not only tactical victory, but the humiliation of the enemy. Many early medals of honor were awarded for such captures. Soldiers risked their lives to grab banners from amidst gunfire, sometimes falling with the cloth still in their hands. Flags were not just fabric. They embodied pride, identity, and unity. To lose one was devastating. To gain one was glory. In a war of rifles and cannons, these simple symbols of cloth carried enormous weight, and their defense and capture were matters of life, death, and undying honor. Confederate battle flags evolved from confusion with Union colors. Early in the war, Confederate units often carried flags that looked remarkably like the US stars and stripes. On smoky battlefields, this resemblance caused deadly confusion. At first Manassas, soldiers hesitated to fire, uncertain if they were aiming at friend or foe. To solve the problem, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard pushed for a new design, a bold cross of stars on a field of red. This became the now famous Confederate battle flag, square in shape and used by many units in the field. It was not originally the national flag of the Confederacy, but its visibility and simplicity made it practical for combat. Over time, it became the enduring symbol of the Confederate cause, far beyond its original purpose of battlefield clarity. The story of its creation is a reminder that even iconic symbols often begin as practical solutions to immediate problems of war. The Battle Hymn of the Republic became the Union's anthem. In 1861, writer Julia Ward Howe visited Union camps near Washington, D.C., and heard soldiers singing John Brown's Body, a rough marching song. Inspired, she penned new lyrics, setting themes of justice, sacrifice, and divine purpose to the same stirring melody. The result was the Battle Hymn of the Republic. With its powerful refrain, "Glory, glory, hallelujah," it became the spiritual anthem of the Union. Soldiers sang it on the march. Congregations echoed it in churches, and its verses wove religion into the struggle for freedom. The song connected the Union's cause to a higher moral calling, portraying the fight not only as political, but as righteous. Its resonance lasted long after the war, sung in movements for justice and at solemn national moments. Born in the chaos of war, the hymn endures as one of America's most powerful songs of resolve and hope. Dixie became the Confederacy's rallying song. Originally composed in 1859 for minstrel shows, Dixie was a lively tune with simple lyrics that quickly caught on across the South. By the time the Civil War began, it had become an unofficial anthem of the Confederacy. Bands played it at rallies, soldiers marched to it, and crowds sang it as a symbol of Southern pride. Even Jefferson Davis used it at his inauguration. Yet the song's popularity extended beyond the South. Lincoln himself reportedly enjoyed it and had it played at events. Dixie illustrates how music carries emotional power, shaping identity and morale. For Confederates, it became inseparable from the cause of independence. For the nation at large, it remains a song with a complicated legacy, once a cheerful melody, later bound to the memory of division. In the Civil War, music was more than entertainment. It was spirit, weapon, and emblem all at once. Old Abe, a live eagle, served as a Union mascot. Among the most unusual soldiers of the Civil War was a bald eagle named Old Abe. Carried into battle by the 8th Wisconsin Infantry, the bird perched on a special shield-like perch beside the regimental colors. With wings spread and piercing cries, Old Abe became a living emblem of courage. Soldiers swore the eagle inspired them in the thick of combat, his fierce screams echoing above the chaos. Confederates, too, knew of him, sometimes aiming at the bird as if felling him would wound Union morale. Old Abe survived dozens of battles, and after the war he toured the country, becoming a symbol of the Union's endurance. He even appeared at veterans' reunions, admired by crowds who had once marched with him. Today, his likeness still adorns military insignia, a reminder that a single bird, carried through smoke and fire, became a soaring emblem of freedom. Horses died in staggering numbers alongside men. The Civil War is remembered for its human toll, but the suffering of animals was immense. Horses and mules were the engines of war, pulling cannons, wagons, and ambulances, and carrying cavalry into battle. They endured hunger, exhaustion, and shellfire. It is estimated that more than 1 million animals perished during the conflict. Soldiers grew deeply attached to their mounts, giving them names, brushing their coats, and mourning them when they fell. On battlefields, dead horses sometimes lay in heaps, grim reminders of war's reach. Without these animals, armies could not have moved or fought, and their sacrifice was as vital as any soldier's. Diaries often speak of the silence after a fight, broken only by the cries of wounded animals. The Civil War was not only a struggle of men and ideas, but also of creatures pressed unwillingly into service, whose lives were spent on dusty roads and bloody fields. Letters home became soldiers' most prized possessions. In camps and trenches, far from family, letters became lifelines. Soldiers waited eagerly for the mail wagon, clutching envelopes with trembling hands. A letter from home could lift spirits more than food or pay. Men tucked them into breast pockets, carried them into battle, and read them by firelight until the paper frayed. Many wrote back in return, filling pages with details of camp life, battles, and longings for home. For illiterate soldiers, comrades or chaplains wrote letters on their behalf. Some letters never reached their destination, lost in the chaos of war, but those that did became cherished artifacts. Today, thousands survive, filled with words of love, fear, and hope. They remind us that behind every musket and uniform was an ordinary person yearning for connection. In a world of gunfire and grief, ink on paper carried the warmth of distant hearths into the cold heart of war. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus to detain suspected rebels. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln made a controversial decision. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, the legal protection that prevents imprisonment without trial. This allowed the government to arrest and detain suspected Confederate sympathizers, spies, and draft resistors without immediate charges. To some, it was a necessary step to preserve the Union in its darkest hour. To others, it was an alarming violation of civil liberties. Newspapers railed against the policy, and critics accused Lincoln of acting like a tyrant. Yet Lincoln argued that extraordinary times demanded extraordinary measures. If the nation perished, he reasoned, then rights would perish with it. The suspension of habeas corpus highlights the tension between liberty and security in wartime, a debate that continues into the modern age. Even as cannon smoke filled the air, the deeper struggle over the meaning of freedom unfolded in courtrooms and government halls. Copperhead leader Clement Vallandigham was exiled to the Confederacy. Clement Vallandigham, an Ohio congressman, became one of the most notorious critics of Lincoln's war policies. A leader among the Copperheads, Northern Democrats who opposed the war, he denounced conscription and accused the administration of trampling on rights. Arrested for his fiery speeches, he was tried by a military tribunal and sentenced to prison. Instead of locking him away, Lincoln ordered him exiled to the Confederacy. Vallandigham, much to his discomfort, was not warmly welcomed in the South and soon made his way to Canada. From there, he continued to publish anti-war statements, even running for governor of Ohio in absentia. His strange journey from Congress to Confederate exile to Canadian refuge shows the heated divisions that fractured not only North and South, but also the Union itself. His story reveals that dissent, even in wartime, can take dramatic and unexpected paths. The Trent Affair nearly brought Britain into the war. In 1861, a Union warship intercepted the British mail packet Trent and seized 2 Confederate envoys bound for Europe. The bold action outraged Britain, which saw it as a violation of neutral rights. Warships mobilized, troops gathered in Canada, and for a tense moment, it seemed Britain might join the Confederacy's side. Lincoln, recognizing the peril, famously said, "One war at a time." The United States released the envoys, diffusing the crisis. The Trent affair underscores how fragile diplomacy was during the Civil War. A single incident on the high seas nearly brought the world's greatest empire into the conflict. Had Britain intervened, the balance might have shifted dramatically in the South's favor. Instead, restraint prevailed, and the Union avoided a disastrous escalation. The episode shows how the Civil War, though fought in America, was shadowed by global powers watching closely from across the seas. European powers backed away after the Emancipation Proclamation. At the start of the war, Britain and France watched the conflict with interest. Both relied on Southern cotton, and the Confederacy hoped that recognition by these nations would secure independence. Yet when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the war became explicitly about slavery as well as union. For Britain and France, where abolitionist sentiment was strong, supporting the Confederacy now risked appearing as an endorsement of slavery. Public opinion shifted, and governments backed away from intervention. The proclamation not only changed the Union's moral cause, but also reshaped international politics. Confederate hopes for recognition evaporated, leaving them isolated. The decision demonstrates how a single document can ripple outward, altering not just domestic resolve, but global diplomacy. By tying the Union's fight to freedom, Lincoln closed the door on foreign aid to the South, ensuring the Civil War would remain largely an American struggle. Pinkerton detectives created one of America's first spy networks. The Union turned to a private detective agency for intelligence, the Pinkertons. Founded by Alan Pinkerton, the agency had already earned a reputation for tracking criminals and protecting railroads. During the war, Pinkerton and his operatives organized one of the first large-scale spy networks in American history. Disguised as civilians, they infiltrated enemy territory, gathered maps, and reported on troop movements. Pinkerton himself became close to Lincoln, even uncovering a plot to assassinate the president in Baltimore before his inauguration. Though their reports sometimes exaggerated Confederate strength, leading to overly cautious decisions, the Pinkertons laid the groundwork for modern intelligence operations. Their methods of surveillance, disguise, and counterespionage echoed into the future. In the Civil War's shadow world of secrets and whispers, the Pinkertons blurred the line between detective work and espionage, proving that wars are fought not only with guns, but with information. Mary Bowser spied inside Richmond with a photographic memory. One of the most remarkable Union spies was Mary Bowser, an African-American woman who worked inside the Confederate White House in Richmond. Disguised as an illiterate servant, she in fact possessed a brilliant memory, able to recall entire documents after a single glance. As she served meals and cleaned rooms, she observed conversations and studied papers left unattended. Her reports, carried through Union sympathizers, provided invaluable intelligence on Confederate plans. Operating in the very heart of Jefferson Davis's household, Bowser risked discovery at every moment, where capture would mean certain death. Her bravery remained largely unsung during her lifetime, but modern historians recognize her as one of the most effective spies of the war. Mary Bowser's story illustrates the hidden contributions of those who fought not with rifles, but with silence, sharp eyes, and a mind capable of turning memory into a weapon. Rose O'Neal Greenhow sent secrets from Washington high society. Rose O'Neal Greenhow was a well-connected Washington socialite who turned her charm into a weapon for the Confederacy. With friends in Congress, diplomats, and even Union officers, She gathered secrets at parties and through whispered conversations. Her intelligence was credited with helping Confederate forces win at First Manassas, where advance warnings of Union plans gave the South an advantage. Eventually, she was arrested and imprisoned, yet even then, she smuggled out messages hidden in her clothing or carried by visitors. Deported to the Confederacy, she continued her espionage abroad, seeking European support. Her life ended dramatically when she drowned returning from a mission, weighed down by gold she carried. Greenhouse's story captures the strange world of wartime espionage, where wit, charm, and access to the right circles could shape the outcome of battles as surely as cannon fire. Belle Boyd, the siren of the Shenandoah, smuggled Confederate intelligence. Young, daring, and charismatic, Belle Boyd became one of the Confederacy's most famous spies. Barely a teenager when the war began, she carried messages through enemy lines, hid dispatches in her clothing, and used her bold personality to charm or distract Union officers. She became known as the Siren of the Shenandoah, her exploits blending courage with theatrics. On more than one occasion, she was arrested, yet she managed to continue her activities, passing along intelligence that aided Confederate commanders like Stonewall Jackson. After the war, Boyd capitalized on her fame, writing memoirs and performing on stage. A legend blurred fact with embellishment, but there is no doubt she risked much for her cause. Her story, like that of many female spies, reminds us that the Civil War's battles were not confined to fields and trenches. They were also fought in whispers, disguises, and secret messages. Women disguised as men secretly fought in battles. Though women were officially barred from combat, dozens secretly donned uniforms and marched into war disguised as men. Some followed husbands or brothers, unwilling to be left behind. Others sought adventure or pay equal to men. They cut their hair, bound their chests, and took on male names. Many fought bravely without discovery, only revealed when wounded or killed. Diaries and records speak of their determination, often noting the surprise of surgeons or officers who realized the truth. Their reasons were varied: love, patriotism, or simply the refusal to be confined to traditional roles. These women blurred gender boundaries in a time of rigid expectations, proving that courage knew no distinction. Their presence on battlefields challenges our image of the Civil War, reminding us that hidden within the ranks were stories of defiance and resilience that only later came to light. Harriet Tubman led a Union raid freeing hundreds of enslaved people. Harriet Tubman is remembered for guiding the enslaved to freedom on the Underground Railroad, but her role in the Civil War is equally remarkable. Serving as a nurse, scout, and spy for the Union, she used her knowledge of terrain and networks of contacts to aid military efforts. In 1863, she helped lead a raid along the Combahee River in South Carolina. Union gunboats carried troops deep into Confederate territory, guided by Tubman's intelligence. The raid freed more than 700 enslaved men, women, and children who fled to the Union mines. Many of the men later enlisted as soldiers, turning freedom into armed service. Tubman thus became the first woman to lead a U.S. military raid. Her story is extraordinary not only for its boldness, but for its scale, a single night that transformed hundreds of lives, driven by one woman's courage and vision. Soldiers experimented with grenades, rockets, and periscopes. The Civil War was a laboratory of invention. Alongside rifles and cannons, soldiers experimented with strange new weapons. Hand grenades, small iron spheres filled with powder and fitted with fuses, were tested, though they often proved unreliable. Rockets were launched, their fiery trails arcing over battlefields, though accuracy was poor. Even periscopes were fashioned, allowing soldiers in trenches to peer over parapets without exposing themselves. Many of these devices were primitive, ahead of their time, yet not fully practical. Still, they foreshadowed the mechanized warfare to come, where grenades, rockets, and trench optics would become standard. For the men who wielded them, the devices must have seemed both marvelous and terrifying, glimpses of a future where invention made war deadlier with each passing year. The Civil War reminds us that necessity and desperation often spur innovation, even in the most destructive of directions. Gatling guns appeared but saw limited action. Richard Gatling's invention, a multi-barreled gun capable of rapid fire, emerged during the Civil War. The Gatling gun could unleash hundreds of rounds per minute, turned by a hand crank. Though it represented a leap toward modern automatic weapons, it was only used sparingly. The Union purchased some, but they were expensive, heavy, and unfamiliar to officers trained in traditional tactics. Still, when deployed, they could devastate enemy formations, spraying a storm of bullets that no line of men could withstand. Gatling himself believed his gun would reduce the size of armies by making war too deadly, a tragic irony given the century of bloodshed his invention heralded. The Gatling gun's presence in the Civil War was more a foreshadowing than a revolution. Yet for those who saw its barrels spin and roar, it must have seemed like a glimpse of the future, a mechanical harbinger of wars to come. Regimental newspapers were printed on portable presses. Amid the chaos of marching and fighting, many regiments carried something unexpected: printing presses. Soldiers set type, inked pages, and produced newspapers filled with camp news, humor, poetry, and reflections. These regimental papers boosted morale, offering entertainment and a sense of community. They also preserved the soldiers' own voices, giving modern readers a glimpse into daily life. Some poked fun at officers, others chronicled hardships, and many circulated far beyond their camps. The fact that presses could be packed onto wagons and hauled through mud and dust speaks to the determination to stay connected and expressive. War is often remembered through official records and grand speeches, but these fragile, ink-stained pages reveal the ordinary laughter, complaints, and creativity of men living through extraordinary times. They remind us that even amid death and danger, the urge to write, share, and print remained unquenchable. PTSD was known as soldier's heart. The Civil War left psychological scars as well as physical ones. Many veterans returned home plagued by nightmares, anxiety, and trembling fits. At the time, doctors had no concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. Instead, they described it as soldier's heart or irritable heart, thinking it was a physical ailment linked to the chest. Symptoms included palpitations, fatigue, and sudden fear, but beneath the medical terms lay what we now recognize as trauma. Soldiers had witnessed horrors beyond comprehension, comrades torn apart, endless death, and the strain of survival. Without understanding or treatment, many suffered in silence. Their struggles remind us that war's costs extend far beyond the battlefield, lingering for years or lifetimes. The phrase, soldier's heart, is oddly poetic, capturing both the physical and emotional burdens carried home. Behind medals and parades, countless veterans bore invisible wounds that words could scarcely contain. Pocket Bibles sometimes stopped bullets and saved lives. For many soldiers, a small Bible was more than a spiritual guide. It was a constant companion tucked into a breast pocket. Countless stories tell of bullets striking these books, lodging in the pages instead of a soldier's heart. Sometimes the projectile pierced deeply, leaving mangled paper and torn scripture, but sparing the life behind it. Soldiers treasured these volumes all the more, seeing them as both holy and lucky. Families at home often inscribed them with prayers or names, so they carried memory as well as faith. In letters, Men described opening their Bibles to find new holes where musket balls had entered, amazed to be alive. While not every story can be verified, the tradition endures as a symbol of protection, both physical and spiritual. In the chaos of war, a pocket-sized book became a fragile shield, guarding men in ways both earthly and divine. Soldiers often scavenged gear from fallen enemies. Supplies were precious in the Civil War, and soldiers quickly learned to take what they could from the battlefield. After the smoke cleared, men scavenged rifles, canteens, boots, blankets, and even bits of food from the dead and wounded. Confederate soldiers, chronically undersupplied, were especially dependent on captured Union gear, often trading in their worn shoes for sturdier Northern ones. Union troops, too, sometimes adopted Confederate haversacks or clothing when theirs wore out. This scavenging was grim, but necessary survival left little room for sentiment. Diaries describe men stripping cartridge boxes from corpses or swapping coats between friend and foe alike. In an era before standardized supply chains could keep up with massive armies, the battlefield itself became a storehouse. It's a stark reminder that war was not only fought with strategy and bravery, but also with the desperate practicality of scavenging from those who no longer needed what they carried. Hardtack biscuits were so tough, they were called tooth dullers. A staple ration of Union soldiers was hardtack, thick, flow-and-water biscuits baked hard enough to survive months in barrels. Soldiers joked that they could break teeth or outlast entire campaigns. Often infested with weevils, hardtack was dunked in coffee or soup to soften it, though many still had to break it with rocks before chewing. The biscuits became the subject of endless camp humor, with songs and poems written about their toughness. Confederates had their own version, called corn dodgers, but Union hardtack achieved legendary status. Soldiers sometimes carved the biscuits into playing pieces or souvenirs, a bit of levity amid the monotony. For all its flaws, hardtack sustained armies on long marches when nothing else could. Its memory endures as a symbol of the soldier's endurance, teeth clenched not only against musket fire, but against the stubborn rations that kept them alive. Coffee was considered more essential than food by many soldiers. For Union soldiers, coffee was the true lifeblood of the army. Issued in generous rations, the beans were roasted and ground over campfires, brewed in tin cups, and consumed at all hours. Soldiers swore they couldn't march or fight without it, calling coffee their most reliable companion. Diaries describe boiling grounds 3 or 4 times to extract every drop, and sharing precious sips with comrades before battle. Confederates, cut off from supplies, envied the smell drifting from Union lines, forced instead to drink bitter substitutes made from chicory or acorns. The craving for coffee was so strong that some soldiers risked enemy fire just to brew a pot. Historians have called it the Union's secret weapon, a stimulant that kept weary men moving. To those in blue, coffee wasn't just a drink. It was warmth, energy, and comfort in a tin cup, warding off exhaustion and despair. Some soldiers made chess pieces from bullets and bone. In the long pauses between battles, soldiers turned to creativity to pass the time. With scraps of lead from bullets or bits of bone, they carved chessmen, checkers, and dominoes. Makeshift boards were scratched into the dirt or painted onto cloth. These games offered mental escape, a chance to think of strategy in play rather than war. A chess piece shaped from melted lead might carry the memory of a battlefield, yet it became part of a quiet evening by firelight. Such pastimes built camaraderie, drawing men together over contests of wit and laughter. Some pieces survive in museums, their rough edges speaking of the tools and patience required to make them. They are reminders that even in hardship, human beings create, play, and imagine. In the shadow of war, small tokens of carved lead and bone carried sparks of ordinary life and fragile peace. Field bands played music even during battles. Music was everywhere in the Civil War. Regimental bands accompanied soldiers on the march, lifted spirits in camp, and sometimes even played while battles raged. The clash of cannon might be answered by a stirring march or a hymn drifting across lines. Music carried messages too. Drummers and buglers gave signals that coordinated troop movements. For soldiers, songs were memory and comfort, tying them back to home. The battle cry of freedom or Lorna could bring tears, while lively jigs brought brief moments of joy. Sometimes Union and Confederate bands, camped within earshot, took turns playing tunes, and soldiers recalled nights when opposing sides joined in singing the same melodies. These moments of shared humanity pierced through the war's brutality. Amid smoke and fear, the sound of fiddles, fifes, and horns reminded men they were still human, not just fighters, but singers, listeners, and dreamers. Baseball spread widely in Union and Confederate camps. Though baseball existed before the Civil War, the conflict helped spread it nationwide. Union soldiers from northern cities brought bats and balls to camp, teaching the game to comrades from rural areas. They played in open fields between drills, improvising bases with stones or sticks. The game became so popular that soldiers even played during lulls in campaigns, and prisoners of war organized leagues inside prison camps. Confederates learned the sport too, and after the war, it blossomed in the South. Veterans carried baseball home with them, embedding it into American culture. In many ways, the Civil War acted as baseball's great accelerator, turning it from a regional pastime into the national game. It was a reminder that even amid war, people longed for play, tradition, and connection. The crack of a bat and the cheer of a team could momentarily drown out the thunder of distant guns. Nicknames like Johnny Rebber and Billy Yank personified the enemy. As the war dragged on, soldiers began to imagine the enemy not as faceless masses, but as familiar figures. The names Johnny Rebber for Confederate soldiers and Billy Yank for Union troops became symbolic stand-ins. Newspapers, songs, and stories portrayed them with humor, bitterness, or grudging respect. For Union men, Johnny Reb was stubborn and defiant for Confederates. Billy Yank was determined and relentless. These nicknames humanized the struggle, reducing vast armies into relatable caricatures. Soldiers themselves sometimes used them, poking fun at their opponents across picket lines or in prisoner exchanges. The persistence of these nicknames shows how conflict creates its own mythology, giving names and faces to foes who might otherwise be anonymous. They softened hatred with familiarity, yet also enshrined division. In the folklore of the Civil War, Johnny and Billy march eternally, the symbolic twins of a divided nation. Many generals were classmates together at West Point. One of the strangest features of the Civil War was how many opposing commanders had once studied side by side at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Stonewall Jackson, and many others knew each other as young cadets, drilling and learning tactics on the same parade grounds. Some had even been roommates or instructors. When war came, old friendships shattered, and men who once dined together found themselves commanding armies against each other. Letters and memoirs reveal the surreal feeling of meeting former classmates on opposite sides of a battlefield. West Point's rigorous training ensured that both Union and Confederate officers shared a deep professional understanding, making the war's campaigns particularly complex and skillful. The Civil War was not just a clash of regions. It was, in some ways, a tragic family quarrel among men trained in the same brotherhood of arms. Robert E. Lee turned down command of Union forces before joining the Confederacy. In April 1861, As the nation fractured, Abraham Lincoln's administration offered Robert E. Lee command of the Union Army. Lee, a decorated officer and deeply respected engineer, was torn. Personally, he opposed secession and slavery troubled his conscience. Yet when Virginia left the Union, his loyalty to his home state outweighed everything else. With sorrow, he declined the Union's offer and resigned his commission. Soon after, he accepted leadership within the Confederate Army. This decision shaped the entire course of the war. Had Lee chosen differently, the Union might have had one of the greatest generals of the age from the start. Instead, he became Lincoln's most formidable adversary. His choice reveals the deep personal conflicts of the time, when loyalty to state, nation, and conscience could collide, forcing individuals into decisions that would alter history. Ulysses S. Grant had once resigned from the army under suspicion of drinking. Long before he became the Union's greatest general, Ulysses S. Grant faced failure. Stationed in remote posts after the Mexican-American War, isolated from family and plagued by loneliness, Grant struggled with alcohol. Rumors spread that he drank heavily, and in 1854 he resigned his commission rather than face disciplinary action. For years he drifted through civilian life, working as a farmer, real estate agent, and store clerk, often facing poverty. When the Civil War erupted, Grant returned to service, starting humbly as a volunteer. His skill, persistence, and quiet determination soon lifted him through the ranks. By 1864, he commanded all Union armies. Grant's story shows that even the most unlikely figures, dismissed, doubted, and scarred by personal struggles, can rise to greatness when history calls. His redemption remains one of the most remarkable transformations in American history, from failed officer to victorious general. William Tecumseh Sherman predicted a long, bloody war before it began. When talk of secession turned to war, William Tecumseh Sherman warned that Americans were underestimating the storm to come. In 1861, he told colleagues that the conflict would not be over in months, but years, and would require hundreds of thousands of men. His grim predictions shocked listeners, who accused him of pessimism, even madness. Newspapers mocked him, and Sherman briefly stepped away from command, suffering a breakdown. Yet time proved him right. The Civil War became the bloodiest in American history, lasting 4 years and costing more than 600,000 lives. Sherman's foresight was not cynicism, but realism. He saw clearly that a nation divided so deeply could not be mended quickly. His reputation recovered, and he went on to lead some of the most decisive campaigns of the war. His early warnings stand as a haunting reminder of how people often cling to illusions before facing hard truths. The Union named battles after rivers, Confederates named them after towns. One curious feature of the Civil War is that the same battles often have 2 names. The Union, with its maps focused on waterways, tended to name battles after nearby rivers or creeks. Thus, they called the first great clash Bull Run, after the stream in Virginia. Confederates, rooted in local geography, named battles after nearby towns or landmarks. They called the same fight Manassas, after the nearby railroad junction. Similar dual names exist for many battles: Antietam versus Sharpsburg, Shiloh versus Pittsburgh Landing. These differences reflected more than preference. They underscored how 2 cultures framed the same events. Even in memory, Union and Confederate soldiers carried different words for the same bloodshed. Today, both names often survive, reminders of how history is shaped not only by what happened, but by the words chosen to describe it. The war introduced dog tags when soldiers pinned names to coats. With death a constant possibility, many soldiers worried about being buried nameless in distant fields. In the absence of official identification, they improvised. Some carved names into wooden discs. Others wrote them on slips of paper pinned inside coats. Metal smiths even sold personalized tags to soldiers eager to ensure they could be recognized if they fell. These early dog tags were often crude, but they carried profound meaning. To die was one thing, to vanish without identity was another. After the war, the idea persisted, eventually leading to standardized military identification tags in the 20th century. The Civil War's improvised tokens remind us of the human yearning to be remembered, to have a name spoken, a grave marked, and a story preserved. Even amid chaos, soldiers sought to ensure they would not be lost to history. Photography captured war dead in public view for the first time. The Civil War marked the first time a nation saw its fallen soldiers preserved in photographs. Matthew Brady and his team carried cumbersome cameras to battlefields like Antietam, capturing stark images of bodies lying in fields and shallow graves. When displayed in northern galleries, these photographs shocked the public. People who had imagined gallantry saw instead the stiff limbs and blank faces of the dead. The images stripped war of romantic illusions, making its cost undeniable. Though the technology could not capture action, exposures were too slow. The haunting stillness of the dead spoke volumes. Newspapers wrote that Brady had brought the battlefield to our very doors. These photographs not only documented history, but transformed how people understood it. For the first time, civilians far from the front could confront the reality of modern war through the unflinching lens of a camera. Telegraph operators often became unsung heroes of communication. The Civil War was the first major conflict where the telegraph played a central role. Lines strung across states carried messages in minutes instead of days, allowing Lincoln and his generals to direct campaigns in near real time. Operators, often young men working long shifts, tapped out orders, intelligence, and casualty reports. Their work was demanding: long hours, constant stress, and the risk of enemy raids cutting lines. They became indispensable, translating dots and dashes into strategy. Lincoln himself spent countless hours in the telegraph office, waiting for updates, his face lit by the clicking instruments. Yet few operators received recognition, their names lost even as their signals shaped battles. The war demonstrated that communication could be as powerful as cannon fire. Behind every charge and retreat lay unseen, hands tapping on brass keys, carrying the voices of commanders across the wires of war. Some generals rode into battle in civilian suits, not uniforms. The image of generals in crisp uniforms was not always reality. Some officers, caught between the sudden outbreak of war and the slow supply of proper attire, entered battles in civilian clothing. Others simply preferred the comfort of old coats or hats. At times, this created confusion. Soldiers could mistake commanders for ordinary men or, worse, fail to recognize them at critical moments. In some cases, generals even courted danger, standing out precisely because they lacked the regulation dress of their peers. The sight of a commander directing troops in a dusty frock coat or a battered slouch hat added to the war's unpredictability. These moments reveal that even in an age of ceremony, war often unfolded with improvisation. The battlefield was less about appearance than presence. Whether in polished brass or plain cloth, leadership was measured by courage, not attire. Entire regiments sometimes came from one town, devastating when losses fell. In both North and South, communities often raised regiments composed almost entirely of local men. Called volunteer regiments or companies, these units brought neighbors, brothers, and friends to war side by side. The bonds were strong, but the risks were terrible. A single bloody battle could decimate an entire town's young men in one day. Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh saw regiments lose half or more of their strength, leaving hometowns devastated. In some places, church pews stood empty, families mourned in rows, and generations were marked by loss. While the camaraderie of local regiments gave soldiers comfort, it also concentrated grief when death came. These stories remind us that wars ripple outward, striking not only individuals but entire communities. For the towns that gave everything, the Civil War left scars visible for decades, etched into cemeteries, memorials, and the memories of those who remained behind. Military camps often became schools, with soldiers learning to read. Not all who entered the Civil War could read or write, but many left with new skills. Camps became makeshift schools where educated comrades or chaplains taught letters and numbers by lantern light. Soldiers practiced by writing letters home, tracing words on scraps of paper or slates. Literacy offered not just personal growth, but connection, the ability to read orders, hymns, or a cherished Bible. For some, the war became the only schooling they ever received. The Union Army also established schools for newly freed African American soldiers, linking military service with education and empowerment. The sight of men drilling by day and studying by night speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. Amid violence and hardship, soldiers reached for knowledge, proving that even in wartime, learning could be a form of survival and a step toward freedom. Drummer boys as young as 12 carried rhythms into battle. Children were not absent from the Civil War. Boys as young as 12, sometimes younger, enlisted as drummers, fifers, or messengers. Too small to carry rifles, they marched at the front with sticks and drums, beating out signals that guided troops in movement and morale. The sharp roll of a drum could rally a line or call men to arms. These boys lived in camps, endured marches, and saw the horrors of battle firsthand. Some were wounded or killed, their youth lost to war. Yet many remembered the experience with pride, their rhythms etched into history as the pulse of the army. The image of a young drummer, drum slung at his side, captures the paradox of the war. Innocence bound up in violence, children thrust into the roles of men. Their beats echoed courage, but also the haunting cost of a nation divided. Lincoln received over 1,000 condolence letters a week after Gettysburg. After the Union victory at Gettysburg in July 1863, the staggering casualties weighed heavily on the nation. Families grieving lost sons and husbands poured their sorrow into letters to Abraham Lincoln. For weeks, more than 1,000 letters arrived each week, offering condolences, prayers, and pleas for the future. Some praised his leadership, others questioned the sacrifices, but all reflected a nation aching from loss. Lincoln, weary and burdened, read many of these letters, finding both comfort and pain in the words of his people. They reminded him of the personal cost of each decision, each order to march or fight. The flood of grief shaped his speeches, including the solemn brevity of the Gettysburg Address. These letters are a testament to how deeply ordinary citizens connected with their president, pouring their anguish into ink, seeking solace from the man who bore the weight of a divided country. Surrender terms at Appomattox let Confederates keep their horses. When Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1864, the terms were surprisingly generous. Confederate soldiers were allowed to keep their personal horses and mules so they could return to farms and rebuild their lives. This small act of mercy reflected Grant's desire for reconciliation rather than humiliation. Lee himself expressed gratitude, recognizing how vital the animals were for spring planting. The gesture helped ease bitterness, allowing soldiers to go home with dignity. It symbolized a recognition that the war was over and healing had to begin. Appomattox is remembered not only as the end of conflict, but as the start of reunion, where swords were sheathed, and the first tentative steps toward peace were taken. The horses, carrying weary men back to their fields, became symbols of renewal in a land scarred by years of destruction. The Civil War remains America's bloodiest conflict, with over 600,000 dead. By the time the war ended in 1864, the toll was almost unimaginable. More than 600,000 soldiers had died. Some estimates suggest even more. This number exceeded the combined American deaths of World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Entire towns were left mourning, families shattered, and landscapes scarred with graves. Disease claimed as many lives as bullets, with camp fevers, dysentery, and infections spreading unchecked. The scale of death reshaped how the nation grieved, leading to new traditions of memorialization, national cemeteries, and rituals of remembrance. The Civil War was fought to preserve the Union and end slavery, but its cost was staggering, leaving a legacy of sorrow alongside progress. Even today, its casualty figures stand as a stark reminder of the war's ferocity. No other conflict has carved so deep a wound into the American story. And so, we have reached the quiet end of our journey through the Civil War. From the battlefields where cannon smoke once rolled, to the small moments of music, coffee, and letters home, we've drifted through echoes of a time that shaped a nation. The Civil War was more than uniforms and strategy. It was lived by people, ordinary and extraordinary, who carried hopes, fears, and endurance through years of hardship. Tonight, their stories have passed before us like lanterns in the dark, each one flickering for a moment before fading softly away. As the voices of the past grow still again, you might picture silent fields under moonlight, where the earth has long since healed, and grass sways where soldiers once stood. The thunder of battle has vanished into memory, but the lessons remain, of resilience, of sorrow, of the fragile threads that bind people together, even in times of division. Here, in this calm space, there's nothing more you need to hold on to. History has carried us across rivers, into camps, and through distant towns. Now it releases us, leaving only quiet, like a page gently closing at the end of a long story. If you enjoy drifting through these explorations of the past, I invite you to like and subscribe to the Sleepy History channel, or simply share a thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is rest. Let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders, as softly as mist lifting from the fields at dawn. Allow your thoughts to slow, your breathing to deepen, and your body to sink into stillness. The story has ended, but sleep is waiting, gentle and unhurried. Let yourself drift toward it, carried by the quiet rhythm of history fading into dreams. Good night.